Hello, my name is Ryan, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Counting from Caleb. In this video, I'm going to present how the week of Yeshua's crucifixion is encoded in the history of Israel. From the selection and inspection of the Passover lamb, to the sacrifice given at Passover, and to his resurrection and presentation of firstfruits. This video will further build on my 70 Weeks Decreed video, in which I believe Israel is given 70 weeks of Jubilee, or a period of 3,430 years, from the inheritance of the Promised Land to the day of the Lord and an entrance into the millennial kingdom. It is the continuation of this same sabbatical cycle going further back in time that builds this amazing picture and provides further evidence that we are on the correct timeline for sabbatical and Jubilee cycles. I believe it shows that God has always had this cycle in place and it has never been interrupted. "70 weeks are decreed for your people and your holy city, to stop their transgression, to put an end to sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the Most Holy." The Most Holy meaning Messiah. This 70 weeks being 70 weeks of Jubilee cycles, totaling 3,430 years. My theory being that this is the time period specified of 70 weeks decreed on your people and holy city, spoken of in Daniel 9:24 through 27, has multiple layers of fulfillment. Within this time frame includes the first and second coming of our Messiah Yeshua, his first coming being the going forth of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, which was 69 total Shabuim, or weeks of years, integrated within this 70 total Shabuim, or weeks of Jubilee. There are multiple layers of fulfillment within this time frame on the micro and macro level, and all point to one endpoint of the harvest of the end of the age. It is the suntelia, the Greek word used that means when the parts come together into a whole, or consummation, or an end involving many parts. I need to give credit to the YouTube channel Nathan H83 for his excellent video titled, "How Long Were the Israelites in Egypt?", as this video set me on my path of biblical chronology years ago, and he really does an excellent job of explaining the total length of time that Israel was in Canaan and Egypt. I recommend you watch it. So we will begin to work backwards from the inheritance of the Promised Land, which I showed in my previous videos is calculated from Caleb's inheritance of Hebron. The timing of Caleb's inheritance is the same time the tribes of Israel were allotted their inheritance of the Promised Land as well. We learned that the inheritance of the Promised Land occurred in 1400 BC, or 2361 Hebrew. Entry into the Promised Land occurred in 1406 BC, or 2355, 6 years earlier. This places the Exodus 40 years earlier in 1446 BC, Hebrew year 2315. Genesis 7:7 says Moses was 80 years old and Aaron was 83 when they spoke to Pharaoh. So we can place Moses' birth 80 years before the Exodus in year 1526 BC, Hebrew year 2235. So Moses received the law on Mount Sinai in the year of the Exodus in 1446 BC, Hebrew year 2315. It is from here that we will continue to work backwards in time. We are told in the Septuagint version of the Old Testament in Exodus 12:40, "And the sojourning of the children of Israel, while they sojourned in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, was 430 years. And it came to pass, after the 430 years, all the forces of the Lord came forth out of the land of Egypt by night." This also matches Galatians 3:16 and 17, in which Paul says, "The promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. The law that came 430 years later does not revoke the covenant previously established by God so as to nullify the promise." So the promise given to Abraham was given 430 years prior to the year of the Exodus in which the law was received. Flavius Josephus was a Jewish historian that lived during the 1st century, and he states in the Antiquities of the Jews, "They left Egypt in the month of Nisan, on the 15th day of the lunar month, 430 years after our forefather Abraham came into Canaan, but 215 years only after Jacob removed into Egypt. So if we subtract 430 years from 1446 BC, 2315 Hebrew, the year of the Exodus, we arrive at the year 1876 BC, or 1885 Hebrew. The 430 years thus starts from when Abraham arrived in Canaan, a land not his own, at 75 years old. If we add 25 years to this, we arrive at year 1851 BC, or 1910 Hebrew, when Isaac was born at 100 years of age. Genesis 21:5 says, Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Genesis 25:26 says, after this, his brother came out grasping Esau's heel. So he was named Jacob, and Isaac was 60 years old when the twins were born. So 60 years later, after Isaac was born, in the year 1791 BC, which is Hebrew year 1970, Jacob is born. Now we can locate the year all of Israel entered Egypt with Jacob's age. Genesis 47:5-6 states, Pharaoh said to Joseph, now that your father and brothers have come to you, the land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and brothers in the best part of the land. They may dwell in the land of Goshen. And if you know of any talented men among you, put them in charge of my own livestock. And in Genesis 47:8-9, how many years have you lived? Pharaoh asked. My travels have lasted 130 years, Jacob replied. My years have been few and hard, and they have not matched the years of the travels of my fathers. So Jacob is 130 years old when all of Israel entered Egypt. This would be the year 1661 BC and Hebrew year 2100. From the year 1876 BC, 1885 Hebrew, when Abraham received the promise, to when all of Israel entered Egypt, is thus a total of 215 years, right in the center of the 430 years. So Israel was in the land of Canaan 215 years, and in the land of Egypt 215 years, for a total of 430 years. Again, Exodus 12:40 in the Greek Septuagint says, and the sojourning of the children of Israel, while they sojourned in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, was 430 years. Flavius Josephus again agrees with this, stating, 430 years after our forefather Abraham came into Canaan, but 215 years only after Jacob removed into Egypt. So he's saying the Exodus and receiving the law occurred 430 years after Abraham came into Canaan, and 215 years after Jacob and all of Israel entered Egypt. From the date Israel entered Egypt to the year 1526 BC, 2235 Hebrew, when Moses was born, leaves a gap of 135 years. Let's see if we can narrow it down and find out when Israel entered into slavery. It says in Exodus 1:6-8, and Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation. And there arose up another king over Egypt, who knew not Joseph. So it wasn't until after Joseph died that another Pharaoh arose and enslaved Israel. Genesis 41:46 says, Now Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Joseph told Pharaoh that 7 years of abundance would be followed by 7 years of famine, and Pharaoh put him in charge of preparing Egypt for the 7 years of famine. His entering into Pharaoh's service would be at the beginning of the 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of famine. Genesis 45:6-7 says, For the famine has covered the land these 2 years, and there will be 5 more years without plowing or harvesting. God sent me before you to preserve you as a remnant on the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So this is saying that all of Israel arrived after 2 years of famine had already taken place, with 5 years remaining. The 7 years of abundance had already passed, and they were 2 years into the period of famine. For a total of 9 years, Joseph had been in Pharaoh's service, making him 39 years old at this point. This places all of Israel entering Egypt in 1661 BC, 2100 Hebrew. It says in Genesis 50:22, "Now Joseph and his father's household remained in Egypt, and Joseph lived to an age of 110. So if he was 110 when he died, and was 39 when all of Israel entered Egypt, this would be 71 years that Israel was in Egypt until his death. This places his death in the year 1590 BC, 2171 Hebrew. And there arose another king over Egypt, who knew not Joseph." So this leaves a gap of 64 years from Joseph's death to Moses' birth for this new Pharaoh to arise and enslave Egypt, because they were already in slavery at Moses' birth. So at what date were they enslaved? First, we must cover one more topic. Genesis 15:13-14 says, "Then Yahweh said to Abram, Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. But I will judge the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will depart with many possessions." So it says that Israel will be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years in a land not their own. Both Canaan and Egypt were not a land of their own. Isaac was the seed of Abraham that would give birth to Israel. Galatians 4:28-29 says, "Now you brothers, like Isaac, are children of promise. At that time, however, the son born by the flesh persecuted the son born by the Spirit, Ishmael being the son born by the flesh, and Isaac, Abraham's seed, being the son born by the Spirit." It says that Israel would be mistreated in a land not their own. Again, both Canaan and Egypt were lands not their own, in which they would be mistreated. Genesis 21:8-9, "So the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham had a great feast on the day Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking her son." According to Jewish rabbinical traditions, weaning could take place anywhere between 18 months and 5 years of age. Based on our timeline, it appears Isaac was weaned at 5 years of age, and the very day Abraham held a great feast in celebration of this event, and Ishmael was mocking him. So if Isaac was 5 when mocking or mistreatment began, this would be 1846 BC, 1915 Hebrew. This is exactly 400 years to the Exodus date of 1446 BC, 2315 Hebrew. So Israel was enslaved and mistreated in a land not their own for 400 years. Now let's get back to the timing of the enslavement. I'm postulating that all of Israel entered slavery 43 years after Joseph died in the year 1547 BC, 2214 Hebrew. During this 43 years is the time period a king that did not know Joseph arose and placed Israel into slavery. This would mean Israel was in slavery a total of 101 years prior to the Exodus. Now I'm going to show you why I think this is the exact year in which this occurred. This is the week of Yeshua's crucifixion, which I believe is the pattern of redemption for man. I'm planning on making a future video on how this pattern is integrated into the final 7 years of tribulation. For this week to make sense, you have to remember that a day begins in the evening and ends the following evening. In Genesis 1, it gives the description of a full day. And there was evening and there was morning. This is the separation of dark from light, encompassing one full day. From evening to morning, darkness. then from morning to evening light. Exodus 12:3 says, "Tell the whole congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of the month each man must select a lamb for his family, one per household. This is the day Yeshua made his triumphant entry on the back of a borrowed donkey's colt. This was the Sabbath day prior to his crucifixion, which was on the 4th day of the week, which is a Wednesday in our week." From the 10th day, the lamb is inspected for any imperfection for 4 days. Exodus 12:6. You must keep it until the 14th day of the month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel will slaughter the animals at twilight. The time of Passover is at twilight on the 14th day of the month, and was the time Yeshua was placed in the grave. This was at the end of the 14th day, but prior to the beginning of the 15th. The 15th day being Hag HaMatzot, the first day of unleavened bread, which is a high Sabbath day. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Yeshua was in the grave the night following the 14th, 15th, and 16th day, making 3 nights. He spent all day in the grave, the 15th, 16th, and 17th, making 3 days. He rose from the grave at twilight at the end of the weekly Sabbath and the beginning of the first day of the week, which is first fruits. 1 Corinthians 15:3-4. For what I have received I pass on to you as of importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures. Then on the first day of the week, very early in the morning, he appeared to Mary near the tomb, when he told her not to cling to him, because he had not yet ascended. After this encounter is when he ascended to the Father in heaven to present himself as firstfruits. So let's place all the dates we have on the Jubilee cycles, which each Jubilee cycle in this case represents a day of the week. You probably already see the outcome, but let's work through it. We will start at the inheritance of the Promised Land, 1400 BC and 2361 Hebrew. 6 years prior to that is when Israel crossed the Jordan and entered the Promised Land in 1406 BC, 2355 Hebrew. 40 years prior to that is the Exodus, the year in which the law was received, in 1446 BC, 2315 Hebrew. Moses was 80 years old at the time of the Exodus, so we can place his year of birth 80 years prior to this date in 1526 BC, 2235 Hebrew. Abram was born in 1951 BC, 1810 Hebrew. He was 75 years old when he received God's promise in year 1876 BC, 1885 Hebrew. It is 430 years from when Abram received God's promise to the Exodus, receiving the law. He was 100 years of age when Isaac was born in year 1851 BC, 1910 Hebrew. Isaac was then weaned at 5 years of age in 1846 BC, 1915 Hebrew. Isaac was then 60 years old when he had Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel in 1791 BC, 1970 Hebrew. So Israel was born on the day that correlates to the 10th day of the month that Yeshua triumphantly rode into Jerusalem, and the day that the Passover lamb is chosen to be inspected for 4 days. Joseph is then born in 1700 BC, 2061 Hebrew, and at 30 years of age is when he enters Pharaoh's service in 1670 BC, 2091 Hebrew. 9 years later, when Joseph is 39, is when all of Israel entered Egypt in 1661 BC, 2100 Hebrew. Jacob dies in 1644 BC, 2117 Hebrew, at 147 years of age. Joseph then dies at age 110 in 1590 BC, 2171 Hebrew, leaving the 64-year gap between his death and Moses' birth, that a Pharaoh that did not know Joseph arose and enslaved Egypt. I'm postulating, based on all other information, that Israel enters slavery in the final sabbatical year of the Jubilee cycle, representing twilight of the 4th day of the week, which would be Passover, when Yeshua was placed in the grave between the 14th and 15th day of the month. He was then in the grave 3 days and 3 nights, as Jonah was in the belly of the great fish, and rose from the grave at twilight at the end of the 3rd day, represented in the Jubilee cycles as the Sabbath day, which would be the 17th day of the month. This is a period of 147 years from slavery, portraying being placed in the grave at the very end of the 4th day of the week, which is a Wednesday to most of the world today in 1547 BC, 2214 Hebrew, to Israel inheriting the Promised Land, representing the resurrection at twilight at the end of the weekly Sabbath in 1400 BC, 2361 Hebrew. 147 years is a period of 49 times 3, but instead of Jubilee to Jubilee, which would represent the beginning of the day, it is the final sabbatical year to final sabbatical year in each Jubilee cycle, representing the end of the day. The day following the weekly Sabbath of Passover is First Fruits. This is the day Yeshua appeared alive to Mary near the tomb very early in the morning. He told her not to cling to him, as he had not yet ascended to the Father to present himself as First Fruits. This is when Israel began sowing the land to begin its first 6 years of sowing and reaping, beginning the 70 weeks of Jubilee to the harvest at the end of the age. This is also the 8th Jubilee cycle from Israel's birth, and the 8th day is when a male child is circumcised. So if we look at where this time period covered is in relation to the 70 weeks of Jubilee, we can see that Israel entered slavery at the very end of the 4th day of the week, and received their inheritance of the Promised Land at the very end of the Jubilee cycle, representing the Sabbath day in the week. This again matches the 3 days and 3 nights Yeshua was in the grave. And just like counting to Shavuot or Pentecost, the counting begins at the weekly Sabbath following Passover. So the counting to the 70 weeks decreed on your people and holy city, a period of 70 weeks of Jubilee, totaling 3,430 years, begins the final sabbatical year of the Jubilee week, when Israel inherited the Promised Land in 1400 BC, Hebrew year 2361. 70 times 49, or 3,430 years, added to this ends in the sabbatical year 5791, or the fall of 2030, beginning the year of wrath and recompense, a sabbatical year ending Daniel's 70th week. In this case, instead of the following first day of the week being Shavuot or Pentecost, it is the following Jubilee year, beginning the millennial kingdom in 2031, 5792 Hebrew. Another thing I found interesting, as I said, there are many layers to this end involving many parts. If we start counting Jubilee cycles, as we would count days, starting with the birth of Jacob, representing Israel, being day 1, the temple built to Yahweh by Solomon was completed in the final sabbatical year of Jubilee cycle number 17, and it was dedicated in the Jubilee year representing the beginning of the 18th day. This matches the day Yeshua rose from the grave, as Passover is the 14th day of the month, and he rose at the end of the 17th day of the month and the beginning of the 18th day. I've always wondered about the significance of the timing of the building of the first temple, and this may be it. Based on all of this, it appears God has encoded the pattern of Yeshua's crucifixion week in the history of Israel. From the selection of the Passover lamb on the 10th day of the month to sacrificing that lamb at twilight, the 14th day. His resurrection occurred at the end of the weekly Sabbath, represented by Israel's inheritance of the Promised Land. It appears that God's counting of sabbatical cycles has been uninterrupted from the beginning of creation, and that there is a set time man is given that is quickly approaching. If indeed the end of this time is the 70 weeks of Jubilee decreed by God to Israel, based on my calculations, we are at the doorstep of the final 7 years. Thank you for watching. Our King Yeshua is returning soon. Hallelujah. Shalom.